in the vast highland valleys of central Mexico, where the sun poured down upon steep stone steps leading to towering temples. A mighty civilization once thrived. This was the Aztec Empire, born of blood, labor, and an unshakable faith in the gods. To the Aztecs, life and death were not opposites, but two faces of the same eternal cycle. They believed that the human heart, still beating in the chest, was a sacred offering capable of nourishing the gods and keeping the sun rising each day. As dawn painted the skies above Tenochtitlan in hues of gold and red, deep drumbeats echoed across the waters of Lake Texcoco. Atop the temples that crowned the city, priests began to prepare the most sacred ritual of all. A human sacrifice was not an act of cruelty in their eyes, but a solemn duty. It was the price of harmony, the nourishment of the divine, the thread that held the universe together. Tenochtitlan was more than a city. It was the heart of the empire, built upon man-made islands connected by raised causeways and intricate canals. It was a marvel of planning, engineering, and belief. Its bustling markets, grand palaces, and towering temples housed hundreds of thousands of people. In every stone and every pathway, the presence of the gods was felt. At the center of their beliefs stood Huitzilopochtli, the god of war, the god of the sun and the divine guide who had led the Mexica people from the mythical land of Aztlan to their promised home. To keep him strong, to keep him moving across the sky, the Aztecs believed he needed blood. Not just any blood, the heart's blood, the purest essence of life. The great temple known as Templo Mayor stood as the gateway between the mortal and the divine. It was here, at the summit, that the rituals took place. The priests, clad in jaguar skins, their faces painted in black and red, would lead the chosen up the long, steep steps. The sound of chanting, the rhythm of the drums, and the scent of copal smoke filled the air as the ceremony began. The victims, often prisoners of war, but sometimes willing volunteers, were regarded not with contempt, but reverence. They were the messengers to the gods. Before the ritual, they were honored, clothed, and even given feasts. Their sacrifice was not seen as defeat, but elevation. They were about to become one with the divine. When the time came, the chosen would lie upon a stone slab. The high priest, wielding a blade carved from obsidian sharp enough to slice through flesh with a whisper, would make a quick incision across the chest. The heart, still warm and beating, was raised high toward the heavens. Blood would spill down the temple steps, mingling with incense and song, a symbol of gratitude and faith. To modern eyes, such rituals may seem horrifying, but to the Aztecs, they were not acts of barbarism. They were expressions of devotion. They were echoes of creation. According to Aztec mythology, the world had ended and begun many times. In one such age, the sun had refused to rise until the gods themselves sacrificed their lives. The pattern was clear. Sacrifice was the foundation of existence. Without it, the world would slip into chaos. Beyond Huitzilopochtli, there were other gods who demanded offerings. Tlaloc, the rain god, received children, their tears believed to summon rain. Tezcatlipoca, the god of fate and darkness, required brave warriors. In some rituals, those chosen would live as avatars of the gods for an entire year before their final moment. Spanish chroniclers who witnessed the empire in its final years claimed that thousands were sacrificed during grand festivals. While modern historians debate the exact numbers, no one denies the scale and solemnity of the rituals. These were not casual or mindless acts. They were central to Aztec identity, religion, and governance. Montezuma II, the most famous of the Aztec emperors, understood the political power of sacrifice. During his reign, the so-called flower wars were fought. These were not wars to kill, but to capture. Prisoners were not executed on the battlefield, but brought back to Tenochtitlan for ceremonial offerings. These wars sustained not only the gods, but the emperor's authority. On the days of sacrifice, the entire city seemed to hold its breath. Some prayed, some wept, others watched in silence, but none turned away. This was their duty, their gift to the cosmos. In giving life, they believed they preserved life. A single death was never an end. It was a rebirth, a soul sent to walk among the gods. Long before the Spanish ships appeared on the eastern shores of the continent, the Aztec priests had mastered the rhythm of time. They divided the heavens into layers, the earth into directions, the days into sacred cycles. Their calendar was not simply a way to count days, but a living record of divine forces at play. Each day had its patron god, its destiny, its own character, and each sacrifice was carefully timed to align with these cosmic flows. The Tonalpohualli, their sacred calendar, was made of 260 days. It combined 20 signs and 13 numbers, producing unique day names that guided every major ritual. The secular calendar, called Shopahualli, followed the solar year of 365 days. Together, these two calendars wove a complex pattern, a map of spiritual balance. Festivals were tied to their intersections, and the great ceremonies of sacrifice often occurred when their cycles aligned. One of the most important of these ceremonies was the Conquistadors festival. Dedicated to Huitzilopochtli, it took place in the last month of the solar year, a time of endings and renewal. Preparations began weeks before, with fasting, song, and the creation of ritual images. The entire city participated, markets closed, walls were adorned with flowers and painted banners. The smell of incense drifted across the lake, mingling with the sweet aroma of tamales and cacao. On the day of the ritual, a young man who had been chosen to represent Huitzilopochtli descended the temple steps for the final time. For a full year, he had been treated as the living image of the god. He had been taught music and poetry. He had dined with nobles and walked among the people dressed in radiant robes. Now, as the crowd watched in reverent silence, he was led up again, not as a man, but as a divine embodiment. No one cried out, no one protested. This was the way of things. The sacrifice of the god through his human vessel ensured the cycle of time would not break. His death was not a loss but a promise. That the sun would rise again. That the crops would return. That the lake would not dry. It was not cruelty but continuity. Not all sacrifices took place in the great temples. Some were performed in distant cities, in fields, or even on mountaintops. There were sacrifices to rivers, to stars, to volcanoes. Some were quiet affairs, others were grand, with dancers, acrobats, and musicians. In the city of Cholula, sacred to Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent god of wisdom, ceremonies were filled with poetry and song. Here, the heart was not only a gift of blood, but of knowledge and spirit. To the Aztecs, the body was not just flesh and bone. It was a vessel of cosmic forces. The head was ruled by Tonali, a form of sacred heat that connected one to the sun. The heart was governed by Teolia, the soul that lived in fire. The liver held Ihayatl, the breath of emotion and desire. When a person was sacrificed, these forces were released back into the universe, replenishing its balance. Children, too, were sometimes chosen for sacrifice, especially for the rain god Tlaloc. Though the thought seems unbearable to modern minds, the Aztecs believed that the tears of the innocent had power. During the Huitzilopochtli festival, children were bathed, adorned with garlands, and carried up into the hills. Their cries were seen not as suffering, but as sacred signals to the heavens. Rain would follow, crops would flourish, families would eat. Even in death, the Aztecs saw purpose. Warriors who died in battle or in sacrifice were promised a special afterlife. They would accompany the sun on its journey across the sky. In the morning, they would rise with him in the east. At noon, they would shout from the heavens. At night, they would follow him into the underworld. Later, their souls would return as hummingbirds and butterflies, fluttering among flowers, whispering stories of glory. Women who died in childbirth were granted similar honor. They had battled in the sacred war of life. Their spirits joined the warriors, their cries echoing in the winds that swept through the mountain passes. To die giving life or defending it was the noblest end. The priests themselves were not detached from this world of blood and faith. They lived disciplined lives, filled with fasting, silence, and prayer. Their duties were not only to the gods but to history itself. They preserved oral traditions, kept records, carved codices into bark and deerskin. Some priests spent decades memorizing chants and epics. Others specialized in astronomy, using the movement of Venus and the moon to determine when rituals should occur. Among them was a small group known as the Tlamakask, the givers. These priests performed the actual sacrifices. They were chosen not for cruelty but for calmness. They had to remain steady, composed, precise. One mistake during the ritual could offend the gods, could fracture the delicate harmony between worlds. They carried out their role with the same gravity as a judge or a doctor. To them, it was not death, it was a passage, a necessity. Across the city, murals and carvings told stories of these rituals. They depicted warriors holding hearts aloft, gods feasting on fire, sons fed by sacrifice. These images were not meant to frighten. but to remind, every child born in Tenochtitlan grew up knowing the importance of sacrifice. It was not a secret, it was a foundation, a truth as real as the stones of the causeways or the waters of the lake. Visitors from other regions, even allies, were often unsettled by the practices. Some tried to understand, others recoiled, but none could deny the power, the devotion, the unity of a people who believed they were keeping the universe alive. One offering at a time. As the days moved slowly across the Valley of Mexico, each moment of sunlight was seen as a fragile gift, earned through the careful devotion of a people who believed they walked beside gods. Every festival, every ritual, every breath carried with it a sacred weight. Among the many ceremonies that shaped the Aztec world, one stood apart for its haunting beauty and quiet finality. It was called the Toxcatl. Toxcatl came in the middle of the solar year, during the month of drought and stillness. It was the festival of Tezcatlipoca, the god of mystery and smoke, of illusions and fate, unlike the sunlit glory of Huitzilopochtli or the nourishing mercy of Tlaloc. Tezcatlipoca was a shadowy figure. He was the invisible wind, the night that watched. He was both giver and taker of power, and the ceremony in his name reflected his contradictions. A year before the festival began, the priests chose one young man, perfect in form and grace. He had to be strong, elegant, and serene. He would live not as a man, but as Tezcatlipoca himself. For a full year, he would walk the streets of Tenochtitlan dressed in shimmering garments, his hair adorned with quetzal feathers, his face calm and radiant. Wherever he walked, people bowed, whispered prayers, offered him food and flowers. Children smiled at him, women wept in his presence. He was not feared, he was loved. For a year, he played the flute and sang. He offered blessings. He learned the poetry of the gods. He lived in a palace, surrounded by beauty and music. But everyone knew the truth. Even him. His role was not to live forever. His purpose was to die well. When the final day of Toxcatl arrived, the city gathered in reverent silence. The young man, still adorned like a god, walked slowly through the streets. He carried his flute with him. With every step, he played a gentle melody. The song was not mournful. It was soft, peaceful, like a farewell whispered to the wind. People laid flowers in his path. Some reached out to touch his robes. Others simply bowed. At the base of the great temple, he ascended the steps without resistance. There was no struggle, no fear. He knew what awaited him. He was not walking to his death, but toward the fulfillment of his destiny. At the summit, the priests greeted him with calm hands. The ritual was performed with dignity, in full silence, as if time itself paused to watch. His heart, once lifted skyward, was placed in the sacred fire. The cycle was complete. Not all sacrifices were so ceremonial. In the distant corners of the empire, in mountain villages and along riverbanks, simpler offerings took place. Corn, jade, and blood from the tongue or earlobes were given as gifts. Not every sacrifice required death. Sometimes it was enough to let blood flow from a cut made by an obsidian shard. Even kings bled for the gods. Montezuma himself, before he was emperor, offered blood during important festivals to prove his worthiness. Blood was more than a symbol. It was power. It was memory. It connected the living to the divine, the past to the present. Parents would sometimes offer a drop of their own blood when naming a child. Warriors smeared blood onto their weapons before battle. Priests touched blood to statues of the gods during important days of the calendar. Each act, no matter how small, carried meaning. The Aztecs saw sacrifice in nature too. The sun gave its light but vanished each evening. The moon changed its face. Rain came and then retreated. Seeds buried in soil gave up their shells to become plants. Life required giving. Creation required loss. In this view, sacrifice was not a punishment. It was a truth of the universe. Even the temples themselves were built with layers of sacrifice. The Templo Mayor, the heart of the city, had been rebuilt several times. Each new layer rose higher than the last. Beneath its foundations were offerings of jade, shells, animal bones, and sometimes human remains. As the city grew in power, so too did its devotion. Each stone placed was more than construction. It was prayer, a promise that the empire stood with the gods. There were festivals of renewal, like the new fire ceremony, held once every 52 years when the solar and ritual calendars aligned. On that night, all fires across the empire were extinguished. The people waited in darkness, hearts trembling. Priests climbed a sacred mountain. There, in total silence, they waited for the stars to reach a specific point in the sky. If the fire kindled successfully on a sacrificed body, the cycle would begin anew. When the flame did ignite, it was carried by runners across the empire. Every home received the sacred flame. Fires were rekindled, food was prepared again, laughter returned. The people believed they had earned 50 more years of existence. It was not just a celebration, it was survival. The Spanish would later write of these rituals with horror. They called them savage, cruel, unthinkable, but the Aztecs did not see them that way. They saw them as beautiful, as necessary, as the deepest form of reverence. Even the victims were not victims in the modern sense. They were honored, cherished, remembered, their names were spoken with pride. To be chosen was not always a curse. For some, it was the highest possible honor. Captives would sometimes compete in ritual games like gladiators, not for freedom, but for the right to die in the name of the gods. In one such festival, a warrior was armed and placed in a circle. He would fight multiple elite soldiers one after another. If he stood his ground well, his name would be sung for generations. The Aztec world was one of great contrast. Flowers and feathers, blades and blood, poetry and fire. They did not separate beauty from pain, or life from death. Everything was bound together. The gods watched, the people gave, and in that balance, the world turned. The city of Tenochtitlan, resting on the surface of a great lake, was more than a capital. It was a symbol of order, balance, and sacred design. Its canals mirrored the heavens. Its temples rose like mountains in miniature. Its walkways followed celestial patterns. And in its heart stood the Templo Mayor, the place where sacrifice met the sky. To an outsider, the temple was a structure of stone and steps. But to the Aztecs, it was the center of the universe. It was built as a double pyramid, one half dedicated to Tlaloc, the god of rain and water, the other to Huitzilopochtli, the god of war and sun. From the very top, the priests could see every corner of the city, from floating gardens to distant markets. Each time a great sacrifice was performed, the steps were swept clean, the altars prepared with ritual paints, and the air thickened with the scent of burning copal. Drums would echo across the lake. Conch shells would be blown in slow patterns, guiding the spirits to gather. The sky would often seem to hold its breath. Time slowed. Among the most solemn rituals was the offering of captured warriors. The Aztec Empire was built not only through diplomacy but through war, especially through the Flower Wars. These were conflicts not meant for territory, but for capturing worthy opponents. Warriors from Tlaxcala, Huexotzinco, and other neighboring states were taken alive. They were not treated with cruelty. They were fed, clothed, and prepared with care. Each was told of the role they would serve. They were not seen as enemies anymore but as sacred gifts. On the day of the ritual, they were led in procession, wearing fine garments, their faces painted, their names were recorded, their origin was honored. As they climbed the stairs, they were offered the last chance to speak to the gods. Many walked proudly. They believed their deaths would elevate their spirits. The act itself was precise. The priest's obsidian blade, sharp as glass, entered just below the ribcage. The heart, still beating, was raised to the sky, then placed in a burning brazier. Blood flowed, not wastefully, but with ceremony. The body was then respectfully handled, sometimes burned, sometimes buried, sometimes given to noble families for ritual feasting. Each step had meaning. Feasting after sacrifice was not an act of savagery but of communion. It was rare and always ceremonial. The flesh was cooked with maize and peppers, shared among priests and elders. To eat the body of one who had been given to the gods was believed to transfer strength and sacred energy. It was never taken lightly. It was done with chants, prayers, and solemn faces. In rural temples, far from the lake, smaller ceremonies unfolded with equal reverence. In a village at the edge of a forest, a farmer might offer a chicken, a rabbit, or a handful of corn soaked in his own blood. He would whisper to the earth, to the trees, to the wind that danced through his crops. He asked for rain, for safety, for life. The gods listened everywhere, not only in the capital. Children were taught from an early age about these beliefs, not with fear, but with story. In schools known as Kameka and Telpakeli, they learned about the stars, the winds, the great battles of the gods. They recited poetry, painted codices, and performed small rituals. They knew that sacrifice was not just the offering of blood, but the offering of time, energy, and purpose. Some children became priests, others became warriors, some became farmers, merchants, or builders, but all were part of the sacred cycle. Each cornfield harvested, each fish caught from the lake, was a form of prayer. Life itself was seen as borrowed from the gods. To give back was to maintain the balance. The Aztecs also believed in omens. They looked for signs in the flight of birds, in dreams, in the patterns of smoke. Priests read the codices and sky for warnings. If a bad harvest followed a festival, they might say the offering was not sufficient. If war went poorly, they would prepare a more solemn sacrifice. They adjusted not out of fear, but respect. The gods were not cruel, just demanding. In the grand markets of Tlatelolco, the smell of flowers, chocolate, and burning incense floated through the air. Among the traders were those selling ritual objects, small figurines made of dough or obsidian. These were often used in household sacrifices. Not all rituals needed temples. Some took place in kitchens, in gardens, at lake edges. A quiet prayer, a handful of salt, a whispered name into the flame of a candle. Aztec nobility also performed private sacrifices. Emperors would fast before important decisions. They would pierce their tongues or ears and let the blood fall onto paper, which was then burned in sacred fire. This act was called auto-sacrifice, and it was deeply personal. Even the most powerful were not above the gods. They humbled themselves before each campaign, each treaty, each eclipse. Women had their own rituals. Midwives prayed over births. Healers offered flowers and feathers to goddesses like Xochiquetzal and Lizolteotl. Women sang lullabies that were also prayers, telling their babies of the stars and the sacred lake. Life and death were never far apart. One gave meaning to the other. As the empire expanded, so did its ceremonies. New gods were added. Temples were built in conquered cities. Yet Tenochtitlan remained the heart. Its stones remembered every step. Its waters reflected every fire. Its people, though feared by outsiders, saw themselves as protectors of the sun. Every morning, they watched the sky carefully. Every sunrise confirmed that yesterday's sacrifice had been accepted. Every sunset reminded them that another would be needed. The world depended on them, not in arrogance, but in faith. In the rhythm of daily life, the people of the Aztec Empire moved through a world soaked in layers of meaning. Every season had its festival, every month its rituals. The calendar was not just a way to mark time but a map of duties owed to the gods. There were 18 months in the Aztec solar calendar, each with its own celebrations, and each celebration with its own forms of sacrifice. One of the most moving and delicate of these occurred during the month of Oxpanistli, the time of sweeping. It was a festival of renewal, dedicated to the goddess Tosi, known as the Mother of Gods, the Grandmother, the goddess of healing and midwifery, but also of war and purification. Her festival began with silence and ended in powerful transformation. Before the final day, the city's streets were swept clean by women. It was not just cleaning, it was spiritual preparation, the removal of sickness and shadow. Even children joined, gathering leaves, brushing stones, throwing away old food. The act was gentle, slow, and rhythmic. It told the earth, "We are ready, the goddess is near." At the heart of the ceremony, a woman was chosen to represent Tosi. She was not taken against her will. She was selected with honor. For weeks she was treated with reverence. Dressed in fine garments, fed sacred foods, she lived in peace, surrounded by singing and prayer. And when the day came, she walked calmly to the temple. Her sacrifice was not an end. It was a rebirth. Her spirit, they believed, would become one with Tosi. Through her death, the earth would be cleansed. Crops would grow strong. Sickness would fade. The people would be renewed. It was a painful offering wrapped in beauty and belief. The sacrifice itself, though solemn, was gentle in its rituals. The people watched in quiet prayer. They did not cheer. They did not weep. They breathed together in stillness. There were also festivals for children. Tlaloc, the rain god, was a kind and demanding spirit. He ruled over the mountain springs, the clouds, the rivers. To please him, children were sometimes offered in highland temples, especially during years of drought. These children were not strangers. They were chosen carefully, often orphans or those offered by their families. Their journey to the temple was filled with songs, flowers, and laughter. The priests believed that the children's tears were powerful. If they wept on the way, it was seen as a sign that the rain would come. In the high mountain air, among the mists and stone shrines, the children were laid to rest. Their spirits, it was believed, would become part of the clouds, guiding the rains to the valleys below. To modern eyes, this is hard to understand, but in the Aztec heart, there was no cruelty. There was only a deep trust in the cycle of life and death. The children were not lost. They were transformed, they were remembered in prayers, in carvings, in the first drops of rain that touched the thirsty soil. Some of the most elaborate rituals were performed not in temples, but in nature, on floating gardens, among the reeds of Lake Xochimilco. Farmers would sometimes offer small animals or pieces of food to the water. These were tokens, quiet messages to the spirits beneath the lake. The water was sacred, it fed the fields, filled the canals, and gave life to the fish and birds. At night, when the city fell into silence, the soft sound of oars in the canals could still be heard. Priests would travel by canoe, carrying incense and fire. They would stop at sacred islands, light small fires, and offer prayers to the spirits of the lake. The stars above mirrored the lanterns on the water. It was a time for reflection and whispering to the gods. In homes, families kept small altars. They decorated them with flowers, feathers, and bits of jade. They burned incense and placed cups of water or small figures made of dough. Some families placed the names of their ancestors, believing that the dead watched over them and carried their prayers to the gods. These household altars were not elaborate, but they were sincere, and they were everywhere. The warriors had their own rituals. Before battle, they painted their faces with sacred colors. They sang war chants and offered blood to the sun. They believed that every enemy taken alive was not just a victory but a gift to the gods. Captives were often treated with more respect than enemies who died in battle. A living prisoner meant the sun would rise again. The Eagle Warriors, one of the most honored military orders, wore feathered cloaks and golden jewelry. They saw themselves as the sun's chosen defenders. The Jaguar Warriors, dressed in spotted garments, were fierce and silent hunters. Together, they captured opponents for ritual sacrifice. Their courage was not only measured in blood spilled but in the blood they helped preserve by keeping the gods satisfied. When a captured warrior was brought to the city, he was not mocked. He was given fine food, taught the chants, and prepared for his role. He knew that death was coming, but he also knew his name would live on, that his face might be carved into stone, that songs would remember him. To die on the altar was not shame, it was honor, the kind that echoed through generations. At times, there were grand processions. Dancers in feathered costumes would move through the city, their steps slow and wide, their hands raised to the sky. Musicians played flutes, drums, and shell trumpets. The sound was soft, almost dreamlike. The whole city became a living prayer, a poem made of color and breath and motion. Even silence was sacred. After a great sacrifice, there would often be a moment where no one spoke. The air hung still. The gods, they believed, listened in those quiet spaces. The priests would stand with heads bowed. The people would lower their eyes. The wind would pass gently through the streets, as if carrying messages between heaven and earth. Sacrifice was not just an act of giving. It was a conversation, a reminder, a renewal. The Aztecs did not fear it. They lived with it. They walked beside it in their markets, their homes, their dreams. It was part of their understanding of how the world worked. To give was to keep the world alive. In the sacred city of Tenochtitlan, even the stones seemed to hold stories. The temples, marketplaces, and canals echoed with memories of offerings made and prayers whispered. The people lived not in fear of the gods, but in constant awareness of their presence. They believed the world itself had once been built from sacrifice, and so only through sacrifice could it continue. The creation myths of the Aztecs were full of powerful symbolism. One of the most cherished was the legend of the fifth sun. According to their tradition, the world had been created and destroyed 4 times before. In each era, gods had sacrificed themselves to create light, to bring motion to the stars, to allow humans to walk the earth once more. The current age was the fifth, born when 2 gods, Nanahuatzin and Texistecl, threw themselves into a great fire to become the sun and the moon. Nanahuatzin, the humbler of the 2, was covered in sores and scars. Texistecl, proud and richly adorned, hesitated at the edge of the flames. But Nanahuatzin stepped in without fear, offering himself completely. It was his sacrifice that became the shining sun. Only later did Texistecl follow, becoming the moon, his light dimmer by comparison. The gods, watching, realized that sacrifice alone was not enough. They had to give their own blood to set the sun in motion. They pierced their bodies, let their blood drip onto the earth, and only then did the sun begin to rise. This story taught a lesson that shaped every aspect of Aztec life. Sacrifice was not about loss. It was about creation. It was an act of courage, of generosity, of harmony with the universe. To offer blood was not to destroy but to restore. Even the gods had done so. Humans merely followed their example. The priests who performed sacrifices were deeply trained and highly respected. They lived lives of discipline, rising before dawn, bathing in cold water, fasting for days. They memorized thousands of chants, learned the sacred calendar, and studied the movement of stars. Their tools were not only physical but spiritual. An obsidian blade could cut flesh, but it was the spoken word that connected the act to the divine. Before every major ritual, priests would consult the Tonalpohualli, the sacred calendar of 260 days. Each day had its own name, its own deity, its own meaning. Certain combinations of days were considered powerful. A sacrifice performed on a day ruled by the god Tezcatlipoca, the smoking mirror, would bring visions. One offered under the sign of Quetzalcoatl might ensure peace and fertility. The calendar guided not just sacrifice but planting, marriage, war, and rest. It was a thread that wove all things together. The Templo Mayor stood as the axis mundi, the center of the world. From its summit, priests could see the 4 cardinal directions, each linked to a different color and deity. North was black and ruled by Tezcatlipoca. South was blue and belonged to Huitzilopochtli. East was red, the home of Xipe Totec. West was white and sacred to Quetzalcoatl. The temple itself was a meeting point of these forces, a place where earth and sky embraced. On certain festivals, such as Tlacoxapehualistli, captives were dressed in the flayed skins of sacrificed warriors. This honored Xipe Totec, the flayed one, god of renewal and vegetation. It may seem strange, but to the Aztecs, the shedding of skin symbolized the shedding of old life. Just as snakes shed their skins and fields shed their dry husks in spring. It was not horror, it was rebirth. In ceremonies of this kind, ritual combat sometimes took place. Captives were armed with feathered weapons, unable to harm their opponents, while elite warriors challenged them in turn. It was a dramatic performance, part battle, part sacrifice, part sacred theater. When the final blow came, it was not a punishment but a release. The soul, they believed, would rise through the layers of heaven, carried by eagles and praised by gods. The journey of the soul was a long one. After death, warriors who had died in sacrifice or battle were said to follow the sun on its daily path. In the morning, their spirits rose with the dawn, singing as they traveled. At noon, they reached their highest glory, and as the sun set, they joined it in its descent into the underworld. After 4 years, they would return as hummingbirds and butterflies, dancing among the flowers. Women who died in childbirth were equally honored. They were called Chuatateo, spirits of divine mothers. Their deaths were seen as sacrifices equal to the battlefield. Their spirits were believed to haunt crossroads at night, watching over travelers, offering protection or warning. Small statues were placed at roadsides to honor them. Flowers and incense left in their memory. The underworld, known as Mictlan, was a vast and shadowed realm. Those who died of old age or illness made a long journey through 9 levels. Guided by dogs and guarded by spirits, they passed rivers, mountains, winds of obsidian, and walls of jaguars. Only after many trials would they find rest. Even here, sacrifice played a role. Offerings of food, water, and jade were buried with the dead, not as wealth but as tools for the journey. The living helped the dead through these gifts, ensuring that their passage was safe. Back in the world of the living, sacrifice was never isolated. It touched every life, every corner of the empire. Farmers bled onto their seeds. Merchants burned incense before setting out on journeys. Mothers whispered prayers as they braided their daughters' hair. Every act was a thread in the larger fabric. Nothing was without meaning. And still, the sun rose each morning. Still, the corn grew tall. Still, the rains fell on the lake and the stone streets of Tenochtitlan glistened in their wake. The people watched and waited, ready always to give what was needed to keep the balance. In their hearts, the Aztecs did not seek suffering. They sought harmony. They lived in a world where time was a circle, not a line. A world where death fed life and life honored death. The blood spilled on the altars was not waste. It was memory. It was promise. It was the silent beating heart of a world kept alive through love, ritual, and faith. Night in Tenochtitlan was not dark, but alive with 1,000 flickering lights. Torches lined the temple steps. Fires burned on rooftops, and the canal shimmered beneath the reflection of stars. From a distance, the city looked like it floated on water, a glowing island in the middle of the vast lake, its heart beating in quiet rhythm with the sky above. In this soft darkness, rituals did not stop. Some of the most sacred offerings were made at night, when the veil between worlds felt thinner. Priests walked slowly through the streets, their faces painted with ash, carrying bowls of glowing incense. The smoke curled around corners, drifted through doorways, and hung in the air like a silent song. At the edge of the temple district, musicians sat cross-legged with drums and flutes. Their rhythms were not loud, but steady, like the heartbeat of the earth. With each breath, the city seemed to listen. Even the dogs stopped barking, as if they too were drawn into the hush. These nighttime ceremonies honored the gods of the stars, of mystery, of dreams. Tezcatlipoca, the smoking mirror, was among them. He was a powerful and unpredictable deity, said to appear in visions and shadows. His obsidian mirror could reveal truth or madness. Sacrifices to him were rare, but when they occurred, they were deep with symbolism. In one of the most haunting rituals, a young man would be chosen to represent Tezcatlipoca. This was not punishment, it was considered one of the greatest honors in all of Aztec life. For a full year, the chosen one lived as a god. He wore fine robes, walked freely through the city, and was treated with awe. People bowed in his presence. Children followed him through the markets. He played music, received gifts, and was taught philosophy and poetry. As the year passed, his image appeared in paintings and carvings. His laughter echoed through the gardens. But as the days grew shorter, the tone began to shift. He knew what was coming. As his final day approached, he walked calmly to the lake, where priests waited with a small canoe. He sang as he went, not of fear, but of beauty, of the stars, of the wind, of the earth he would leave behind. On a small island, surrounded by water and firelight, he gave his life. The ceremony was not rushed. It unfolded slowly, with care. The priests moved like dancers, each motion practiced, each word spoken with weight. When the ritual was complete, his body was placed in a sacred tomb, his name remembered, his story passed down for generations. The Aztecs believed that such a sacrifice did not end a life. It lifted it, it joined that person to the rhythm of the cosmos, made them eternal. That belief gave them strength. It allowed them to approach death not with dread, but with a kind of reverence. Elsewhere in the city, smaller rituals echoed this same pattern. A mother might offer a pinch of salt to the fire in her home. A fisherman might whisper a chant before casting his net. These small acts connected the everyday with the divine. Nothing was too simple to be sacred. On certain nights, the moon itself was honored with quiet devotion. It was said to be the face of Texistecl, the god who had hesitated in the fire. People stared at its pale light, not with contempt, but with compassion. He had tried, he had followed, he still gave light, and so he was still loved. The moon inspired songs and dreams. Poets described it as a silver flower, blooming in the sky. Lovers sent prayers to it. Children traced its shape with their fingers. The city's rooftops were filled with silent gazes, each pair of eyes telling a story without words. In the countryside beyond the lake, farmers honored a different rhythm. Their sacrifices were often to Chicomicoatl, the goddess of corn and fertility. Before planting, they would bury small figures made of dough into the earth. They would sprinkle water over the soil, mixed with their own blood. Just a few drops, enough to say, I am part of this land. Enough to say, we grow together. At harvest time, the celebrations were joyful. There was music, dancing, and food shared in abundance. People wore garlands of maize and painted their faces with yellow and green. But even then, sacrifice remained. The first ear of corn was burned, offered to the sky. The best tamales were given to the temple. Gratitude was expressed not only with words, but with action. In times of illness, people turned to Xochipilli, the prince of flowers, the god of art and healing. They brought him blossoms, fragrant herbs, and poetry. They fasted for days, walked barefoot to his shrines, and whispered their troubles into the wind. His presence was gentle, a reminder that beauty and suffering often live side by side. For those healed, a sacrifice of song or dance was made, to give joy in return for mercy. Not all sacrifices involved death. Many were offerings of time, of art, of devotion. A painter who worked by candlelight, shaping feathers into images of gods. A musician who played for hours by a sacred fire, his eyes closed, his mind far from the world. These, too, were seen as holy acts. The gods, it was said, watched the heart more than the blade. Even children were taught to give. In school, they learned the chants, the stories, the names of the gods. They practiced respect. They lit candles, offered food to ants and birds, sang to the rain. They grew up not with fear, but with connection. The world was alive to them. Every tree had a spirit. Every stone held a tale. Every sacrifice was a form of saying thank you. In this world, the line between human and divine was not sharp. It was soft, like the edge of smoke. People lived surrounded by spirits. They walked with ancestors. They dreamed of gods not as distant rulers, but as family. To sacrifice was not to suffer. It was to speak a language older than words. And so, in the quiet of night, with the water lapping gently against the canals, and the stars blinking slowly overhead, the people of Tenochtitlan continued their rituals. Slowly, softly, with care, for they knew that every offering, no matter how small, kept the world in motion. The morning after a great ceremony always felt different in Tenochtitlan. The air was clearer, touched with the scent of burnt copal. The stone steps of the temples still held the warmth of firelight from the night before. The city breathed slowly, as if resting after deep prayer. People walked quietly, their movements soft and deliberate, aware that something sacred had passed through them. The plaza in front of the Templo Mayor bore marks of recent offerings. Flower petals lay scattered, crimson and gold, ashes curled in small spirals where incense had burned through the night. It was not a place of mourning. It was a place of memory. Every trace told a story. Every scent recalled a name. Priests moved carefully among the remains, gathering remnants with reverence. They spoke in low voices, reciting chants to carry the last breaths of the ritual into the day. Young novices followed, sweeping gently, offering maize flour into the wind as a gesture of cleansing. What had happened on the temple steps was now being folded into the rhythm of life. Nearby, the calm surface of Lake Texcoco reflected the sky. Fishermen returned to their tasks, poles dipping into the water with quiet patience. Canoes glided across the lake, their movements smooth, like brushstrokes on a canvas. These men too had witnessed the ceremony. Some had offered fish to the gods, others had simply watched from the water, murmuring prayers to Tlaloc, the god of rain and lakes. Tlaloc was a vital deity, both generous and fierce. He gave rain, but also storms. He filled the lakes, but could drown the fields. Sacrifices to him came in the form of food, jade, and on rare occasions, human life. The Aztecs believed that those who died for Tlaloc, especially children, were taken to a paradise called Tlalocan. It was not a place of pain, but of endless spring. Flowers never wilted, rivers sparkled with sweetness. There was no sickness, only joy. This belief shaped how certain sacrifices were seen. The children chosen for Tlaloc were not taken in cruelty. They were bathed in flowers, given new clothes, and honored with feasts. Their tears were believed to call the rain. And when they left this world, the people sang for them. It was sorrow, yes, but also a kind of sacred farewell. Throughout the city, other gods were remembered too. In the markets, where the scent of cacao and roasted maize drifted on the breeze, traders honored Huitzilopochtli, the lord of merchants. They touched his symbol before each deal, wrapped their goods in sacred cloth, and gave a portion of their earnings to the temple. This was their offering, given not in blood, but in gratitude. Artisans in workshops also gave of themselves. Featherworkers, potters, and sculptors often whispered prayers before beginning their work. They believed that beauty itself was a kind of tribute. A perfectly carved mask or a carefully painted codex could be an offering as powerful as any ritual. They did not separate craft from faith. Each act of creation was a sacred thread. In the calm shade of courtyards, elders told stories to the young. These were not just tales of gods and heroes. They were lessons on how to live. They spoke of sacrifice not only as blood or ritual, but as patience, as kindness, as effort given freely. A farmer who shared his last tortillas. A warrior who protected a village not his own. A child who gave his toy to comfort another. These were the quiet sacrifices. The ones made each day, woven into the fabric of ordinary life. Among the nobility, sacrifice took yet another form. Rulers and nobles were expected to bleed themselves with cactus spines, letting drops fall onto cloth that would be burned as a gift to the gods. This self-offering was a sign of humility. It said, I too must give. I too belong to the earth and the sky. Even those who held power were not above sacrifice. They were its servants. The emperor himself, seated in his palace of painted walls and carved pillars, understood this. He wore a crown of turquoise, his robes rich with gold thread, but he also walked barefoot during certain festivals. He fasted for days, bathed in cold water, and stood before the gods like any other man. His rule was not his alone. It was guided by divine will, earned through devotion. In the heart of the palace stood a private shrine. Here, he came alone to pray. He lit candles, burned copal, and placed jade beads on the altar. The room was quiet, cool, lit only by flickering flame. Even the emperor's voice was soft here. He did not command, he asked, he offered, he waited. Beyond the city, high in the mountains, other forms of sacrifice were practiced. On rare occasions, priests would climb to snow-covered peaks to honor the gods of wind and sky. They carried offerings wrapped in cloth, small statues of gold or stone, food, feathers, and sometimes human life. These mountaintop sacrifices were among the most secret and solemn. They believed the higher one went, the closer one stood to the breath of the divine. The cold on these peaks was biting, the wind unrelenting, but the priests moved slowly, steadily. They sang as they climbed, their voices carried away into the sky. At the summit, they knelt on frozen stone and opened the earth with careful hands. Offerings were placed in small pits, covered with obsidian flakes and colored clay. Then prayers were spoken, asking for rain, for health, for peace. These moments, far from the city, unseen by crowds, held great meaning. The mountain listened, the sky remembered, and the people below, though they might never see the ritual, felt its effect in the falling rain, in the cool breeze over the lake, in the hush of the night. Tenochtitlan thrived not only because of its warriors and builders, but because of this deep current of offering that flowed through everything. It was a city held together by belief, by rhythm, by a quiet agreement between people and gods. Not every sacrifice was dramatic. Most were small, daily, nearly invisible, but they mattered. Each one was a thread in the endless weaving of life. And so the city moved forward, slowly, steadily, held aloft by ritual and memory. Beneath the blazing sun and the silver moon, the people gave what they could, their time, their food, their blood, their love, and in return, the world continued to turn. There was a time each year when the city of Tenochtitlan seemed to hold its breath. It came during the festival of Huitzilopochtli, dedicated to Huitzilopochtli, the flayed one. His image was strange and unsettling. A god shone wearing the skin of another. But behind that image was a deep message about life, about cycles, about renewal through sacrifice. Huitzilopochtli was the god of spring, of rebirth, of agricultural fertility. The Aztecs believed that just as the earth had to shed its old skin to bloom anew, so must people offer something of themselves to ensure the world remained in balance. During this festival, the streets filled with chanting and color. Priests wore costumes made of flayed skins, not out of cruelty, but as a symbol of transformation. They moved through the crowd slowly, silently, becoming a living metaphor. This was not a time of fear but one of awe. People laid flowers before the shrines, offered food and crafts, and gathered in silence for the ceremonies that unfolded over many days. Dancers moved in wide circles, their steps slow and deliberate. They wore rattles on their ankles and bird feathers in their hair. Their movements echoed the path of the sun across the sky. At the heart of this celebration stood the gladiatorial sacrifice. A warrior was chosen, often a captive from battle, but one who had shown exceptional courage. He was given a symbolic sword, feathered and dull, and placed on a round stone platform in the temple plaza. Around him stood 4 well-trained Aztec warriors, armed but respectful. This was not an execution. It was a ritual, rich with meaning. The chosen man fought with everything he had. He danced, spun, and struck with his weapon, trying to hold off the others. Sometimes the battle lasted long minutes, sometimes only a few moments. In either case, it was done under the open sky, before the watching eyes of the gods and the people. It was believed that his struggle helped feed the sun, giving it strength to rise again. After the battle ended, the body was taken away with care. It was not discarded but treated with reverence. The spirit had crossed into the next world, where warriors joined the sun on its daily journey. There was no weeping, only drums, chants, and a deep stillness as the people bowed their heads and remembered what had just taken place. Throughout the city, homes and temples bore the signs of the season. Corn seeds were planted in sacred pots. Skins of animals, representing the old year, were hung on doorways then buried in the earth. Children sang songs of growth and light. Their voices carried softly over the rooftops. The flayed god had been honored, and now the rains could come, the crops could grow, and life could begin again. This cycle was echoed in countless other festivals. The Aztec calendar was rich with moments of giving and receiving, of ending and beginning. Every month had its gods. its rituals, its offerings. Some required blood, others only song, but always there was balance. Always there was meaning. One of the most beautiful rituals was dedicated to the goddess Xochiquetzal, the flower feather, patron of love, beauty, and young women. During her festival, gardens were decorated with ribbons and garlands. Girls wore bright clothing and braided their hair with petals. Offerings of honey, chocolate, and handmade gifts were brought to her temple. There was laughter, music, and dancing. Sacrifice here meant joy given freely. A poem recited, a bracelet woven, a heart opened. On the other side of the sacred spectrum stood the god Huitzilopochtli, the lord of the dead. He ruled over Mictlan, the underworld, where souls traveled after death. His realm was not a place of punishment but a long journey through darkness and silence. The Aztecs did not fear him. They respected him. Offerings to Huitzilopochtli were quiet. Bones arranged carefully, candles lit in small alcoves. Names spoken aloud so that the dead would not be forgotten. Even funerals reflected this calm dignity. When someone passed away, their body was washed and dressed in fine clothing. It was believed that the soul needed 4 years to reach Mictlan. Crossing rivers and mountains, facing winds and shadows, the living helped by leaving food, tools, and precious objects with the body. This too was a sacrifice, giving so that someone else could complete their journey. Priests played an important role in guiding these beliefs. They were more than performers of ritual. They were teachers, historians, poets, and caretakers of memory. From early morning until deep into the night, they studied the codices, recited prayers, and watched the stars. They knew which gods to honor during each eclipse. They knew when to fast and when to feast. And when the people were uncertain, they turned to the priests for clarity. But even the priests made sacrifices. They pierced their own skin with bone needles, let their blood fall onto sacred cloth. They climbed the steep steps of temples barefoot. Even in the cold, they gave not only their knowledge, but their bodies, their comfort, their time. To be a priest was to live in service, to become a bridge between the people and the divine. These quiet, constant acts were what kept the world whole. Without them, the sun might not rise, the rains might not fall, the corn might wither. That was the belief, and it was strong enough to shape an empire. And so the people of Tenochtitlan continued. Each festival marked the passing of time, the turning of the seasons. Each chant echoed with the voices of ancestors. Each sacrifice, great or small, was another thread in the endless fabric of their world. And in the quiet between drums, between steps, between stars, they found a sense of peace, a stillness that came not from the absence of death, but from the understanding of its place in the circle of life. The final hours of the day in Tenochtitlan were always quiet in a different way. The light softened as the sun dipped toward the western mountains. Shadows lengthened across the wide plazas and down the stone steps of the temples. The noise of the markets faded into a distant hum. Canoes returned to their docks, their oars silent against the lake's calm surface. And all around the city, in homes of stone and wood, people turned inward. It was in these quiet hours that the meaning of sacrifice became most deeply felt. Not through spectacle or ceremony, but through reflection. In the flickering light of small fires, families spoke of the gods with soft voices. They told stories, not always of warriors or great temples, but of their own lives, their own gifts. A daughter who rose early to fetch water for an elder. A son who gave up his share of tortillas for a hungry neighbor. A mother who offered thanks to the goddess Chicomicoatl for healthy maize. These moments were not grand, but they were sacred. They were the daily offerings that gave the great rituals their foundation. Without the quiet sacrifices of ordinary people, the city's temples would have been hollow. The gods would have had no true mirror in the lives of the people. In one small corner of the city, a weaver sat in her courtyard, her fingers moving slowly through dyed thread. She was old now, her back bent, her hands rough from years of work, but her eyes still sparkled with the wisdom of long memory. She had seen many ceremonies, many emperors, many seasons come and go. She remembered when the temple was smaller, when the causeways had only just been finished. She remembered walking barefoot in festival processions, carrying flowers in her arms. As she worked, she hummed an old melody, a song passed down through generations. It told of the moon goddess Coyolxauhqui and the moment she fell from the sky. Of her brother Huitzilopochtli, born in fire and light, who protected the people and demanded their loyalty. The song was not sad. It was slow, almost like a lullaby. It reminded her of who she was, and where she came from. Far across the city, In the calm halls of the Kameka, young boys preparing to become priests recited prayers under the guidance of their teachers. They were learning not just words but the rhythm of belief. Each phrase had a weight, each syllable a pulse. They did not rush. They repeated lines over and over, until the sound became a kind of breathing, until the words lived inside them like bones. These boys were not yet ready to offer blood, but they learned of it. They learned the stories behind each god, the meaning of each star in the night sky. They learned when to light incense, when to observe silence, when to speak the names of the dead. Their training was long, but patient. It was itself a kind of sacrifice, the offering of youth in service of memory. As the stars began to appear above the lake, families laid down to sleep, but the city did not fall completely silent. On the highest level of the Templo Mayor, a priest stood watch beside the sacred flame. He did not move, he did not speak. His task was to keep the fire burning until dawn. This flame was not ordinary. It was the heart of the temple, the light of the gods made visible. If it ever went out, it would mean great disaster. So the priest stood there in silence, hour after hour, watching the stars turn. Sometimes he whispered prayers, sometimes he simply breathed. The wind moved gently through the feathers of his headdress. The stone beneath his feet was cold, but his thoughts were warm. He thought of his people, his city, his gods. He thought of the countless sacrifices given through time, and the great cycle they had helped keep alive. And somewhere in the night, a jaguar called from the hills. Its voice was low and echoing, a reminder of the wild world beyond the city's causeways. The Aztecs honored the jaguar. It was a creature of strength and mystery, a symbol of Huitzilopochtli, the smoking mirror god of the night and of fate. They believed that in dreams, the gods often came in animal form, a serpent, an eagle, a deer, a jaguar, each with its message, its wisdom, its purpose. Dreams were important. They were another way the gods spoke. A person who dreamed of fire might be called to serve the temple. A dream of falling might mean a sacrifice was needed. A dream of maize blooming in winter could be a blessing or a warning. Elders knew how to read such things. They passed down their knowledge through quiet conversations, seated on mats, sipping bitter chocolate, watching the smoke rise. Tenochtitlan did not sleep as a single body. It breathed through the night, gently, like a giant at rest. The lake lapped at its shores. The fires flickered in courtyards. The gods watched and waited, content for now. In the great calendar stone, the days turned. A new morning would come, a new offering, a new voice chanting on the temple steps. The people would wake, prepare food, walk to the markets, greet one another with respect, and the memory of the sacrifices would be in every gesture, in the placing of a flower, in the tying of a belt, in the sharing of a bowl. This was not a city built only of stone and blood. It was a city of rhythm, of time, of balance. It was a place where the divine touched the everyday, where belief shaped the very streets, where gods and humans walked in parallel, not separated by fear, but bound by duty, honor, and an ancient, shared story. And in this story, sacrifice was not the end. It was a beginning, a moment of giving that opened the door for rain, for light, for love, for the continuation of all things. As the sky began to lighten and the sacred flame flickered softly, the priest smiled. He had kept his watch. The fire still burned. The world, for another day, was in balance.